In our study of the life divine, we are in the chapter titled The Evolution of the Spiritual Man, where Sri Aurobindo is describing how the spiritual being emerges out of the mental being. And as a first step to a deeper appreciation of the process, he surveys what nature has done so far. She has formed 4 broad lines of interiorization of consciousness. The first being religion, second occultism, which opens you to your inner possibilities, third being the spiritual philosophy, and the fourth direct spiritual experience. And in all these 4, he describes 3 stages of emergence, which 3-stage process, he says, is universal in every method, every process of nature, in emergence of anything. And if we do not understand these stages, we get lost in the procedures of nature, processes, rather than her intention. So what Sri Aurobindo presents here is nature's intention. And once we understand the intention, we will find nature uses many different processes to achieve the same intention. And this is why Sri Aurobindo leads us straight to the very fundamental, deeper processes by which we do not get lost in appearances, but stay with the core. He's elaborating now what happens with religion, and then he will look at the other 3. But when we look at the emergence of religion, its initial confusions, we recognize that early first stage is always mixed. But still, what exactly is religion's purpose? Where is its failure? And the failure, obviously, he points out, is when it demands from us a kind of an absolute acceptance of whatever its inspirations and illuminations are there. Faith, it expects. And this unquestioned acceptance, he points out, would be valid if what it had brought came from a supramental truth consciousness. But it is not so. And so it fails. It repeatedly proves itself to be insufficient. On the other hand, it still is serving a purpose, because it helps us prepare a base of discipline for the true spirituality to emerge. In this paragraph which we are now reading, he points out that evolutionary nature has a wide and supple method which provides for the amplest scope and preserving the true intention of the spiritual seeking. This is nature's way. But what is this wide and supple method of evolutionary nature? And we dwelt on it last time in a general way, but if we consider Sri Aurobindo's description of nature's process, you will find in the Synthesis of Yoga, he explains how in nature's working, wherever she is bringing out a new form, there are always 2 necessities. And this is in the very first chapter of the Synthesis of Yoga. First, he says, every form tends towards a harmonized complexity and totality, which again breaks apart into various channels of special effort and tendency, only to unite once more in a larger and more puissant synthesis. So, nature attempts to bring together a rich, diverse, complex development. Many threads are brought together, and the moment they are sufficiently woven, again she breaks apart, creating specializations, taking towards extremes of specialization, and again rejoining to make again a more rich, more complete, more integral perfection. And then again a breaking apart, and again a rejoining. You will recall Mother's observation sometime in the 1960s that for a long time nature had created specializations of human types. And now, Mother says, she has decided to bring them all together and create a huge mix. And this is the fastest way to create a wide, rich variety of human types. And you will see until that point, every culture, every race, every tradition tended to keep into its own, holding the speciality that it represented. And sometime around there in the 60s, you find this sudden mixing and an urge in humanity to mix across boundaries, across cultures, across traditions, marriages between different races, different nationalities. And all these are part of not human choice, but nature's impulse working within us to fulfill her purpose. And here you have specializations of human types and suddenly brought together to create a rich variety. So we are at a very interesting phase in human evolution where this sudden shift has just taken place or just begun, and we are on that boundary. The second character, though, the second necessity of nature's working, which she describes in the Synthesis of Yoga, is that she builds forms, and there is an imperative rule of effective manifestation is to build forms. Yet all truth and practice too strictly formulated becomes old and loses much, if not all, of its virtue. It must be constantly renovated by fresh streams of the Spirit, vivifying the dead or dying vehicle and changing it if it is to acquire a new life. So this second character of nature's working also we see in the development of, we see that development today in the manner in which all the old forms of religions, or for that matter all cultural and traditional forms, all of these have as if become somewhat ossified, some more, some less. And you see in the heart of humanity a kind of a rebellion, especially among the young, a questioning. First, it starts with a soft questioning. Why? Why are we doing this? Do I really want to do it? And if there is not a sufficiently satisfying answer, then a revolt that says, enough, I don't want to do it. And we see exactly the same pattern, let's say in the last 100 years, maybe a little more or less depending on different spaces around the earth. But with that first rejection comes also a seeking for what then is important, what then is useful. And so a kind of introspection to find your own form or your own meaning in that form. I see this, for example, in many of the modern marriages, where earlier you had marriage ceremonies in India that would last many days, and the major function would last so many hours, people would get tired with all the recitations in Sanskrit, which as a language has been cut off from the life of the people as part of the colonial strategy. Where earlier people would hear the words of the invocations and feel the meaning, now it's just a mumbo jumbo repeated, and people say, well, why am I sitting listening to all this which I don't understand? So they will lean to the priest and say, can you speed it up a little bit? Drop a few things, simplify it. And then you had the extreme revolt of people who said, I will just go through a civil marriage. You sign a paper and it's done. But you come out and then you say, it didn't have the feel of something significant. It didn't have the value which I would want to give to this, meaning which I would want to give to this wedding. And so an attempt to now find your own value, find your own meaning. And one of the patterns I see today is people have translations or summary forms of the mantras which are going to be repeated, which are distributed to all the guests so that they may understand and participate. The priest is asked to explain what he is doing, why he is doing. You may still have the shortened version. But the idea is now somehow to bring a deeper sense into it. Or, as some people do, they create their own ceremony. But what you see here is a form which had become hollow, now needing to be replenished. Now translate these two tendencies, which Aurobindo describes in the Synthesis of Yoga, here to this paragraph, the wide and supple method of evolutionary nature. What is this? She is always widening out, bringing together, widening out, bringing together, and each form has to be renewed, refilled with something which is more true, more real. And the same applies for religions and religious forms. There was a little booklet which was brought out by the Chinmaya Mission, Why Do We... And it lists a whole series of practices, religious practices in the Hindu traditions. Why do you rotate the flame before the deity clockwise? Or in certain deities you go forward and you go backward. What's the idea behind it? Why do you offer coconuts, break coconuts, offer flowers or fruit? Why do you do namaste, joining your palms? All of these questions, and I remember seeing, this must be now almost 15 years ago, that little booklet had sold in some million copies. And it was just a measure of how interested people were in trying to understand what otherwise had become merely empty ritual. But in religious tendencies, you will find the same thing happening, that a specialization of religious forms going into extremes which seem almost to be contradictory, and then a coming together of the religious forms. We will see this, for example, in the more formalized religions, in the Abrahamic traditions, where there is a book or an authority which defines and attempts to hold the entire religious following into a monotone, uniform belief system. You find breakaways. In the Christian tradition, you find from the Catholic Church the breakaway of the Protestants, defining themselves in the very name protest. Protest what? All the things which they saw wrong in the church's working. But in that very movement of a split, there is something which is caught and something which is lost. What is caught is what in the earlier movement seemed to have been lost, which these people now want to revive and bring. And what the earlier movement recoils as if from this breakaway in clinging more strongly to what it holds as more true and more important. And you get this exaggerated separation of the two streams. And once the exaggeration is sufficiently made, the specializations sufficiently fixed in the collective consciousness, nature brings them together. And suddenly you find a stream of people switching sides from one stream to another, as if trying to integrate within themselves these two extreme truths or aspects of a truth. Or forming in the process a third mix of a stream, or a fourth mix, or some other specialization, some other mix. Each of these trying to create a reconciliation of a higher order, a unity of a deeper kind, before again splitting apart and rejoining. You will recall what we took last time as an interesting observation of Swami Vivekananda. When the religions continue to split unendingly until each one has his own religion, that becomes spirituality. But that's the trend in this whole awakening. Whereas you have gone, where initially the forms are much more important, and as you have gone higher up in your consciousness, through this very process, the form becomes less important and what fills the form becomes more important. But you have to go many times through the process of filling, losing, filling, losing. Often, in many religious traditions, special beings take birth, either as an emanation of the divine, as a vibhuti, or some highly developed spiritual saintly beings who have acquired already some deeper realization, who take birth in these traditions to bring a deeper light, to revivify, to give new directions and new forms. Sometimes you will find they echo words used by a completely different tradition. I remember reading some lines from Meister Eckhart. This was in the Christian tradition in Europe. And some lines which he spoke of his experience were so precisely a replica of the text or the words of the Isha Upanishad. One would have sworn that he has read the Isha Upanishad and now reformulated it, except he might not have read at all. he is formulating his experience, a living experience now within the mold of an existing tradition. This would not have been possible if he had come, let's say, from a space where he had acquired the Vedic experience and then comes into the Christian teachers and says, here, this is what you're missing and I'm going to teach you. And they would shut it off saying, you are the devil. He had to be born inside the system, living within its vocabulary, perhaps even born to a family of religious preachers, which would give to him the authenticity to speak, and then infuse from inside that new value. And now suddenly the very forms of an early Christianity, which at that time may have been living, which by now after a few centuries had become hollow, he refills with new value, new experience. And around him forms a whole new awakening, which may last a few dozens of decades or a few hundred years, until it needs to be revivified or modified or some new dimension brought into it, and so on. All of this gives you a bigger picture of the role of religion and the divine interventions inside nature's processes. Now, nature is attempting to do this, but nature needs help. She pushes. But we need also the help from above, which brings more directly the other three lines: occultism, spiritual philosophy, and direct spiritual experience. And it is through these things that even religion is as if made more rich and more complete. So the true intention of the religious seeking of the human being, you can see, and he gives this example, in the development of religion in India, where any number of religious formulations, cults and disciplines have been allowed, even encouraged to subsist side by side, and each man was free to accept and follow that which was congenial to his thought, feeling, temperament, build of the nature. And we read this text last time, so we don't dwell on it further. And this plasticity, Sri Aurobindo says, is necessary for nature's experimental evolution, and he defines nature's real business, which is to prepare man's mind, life and bodily existence for the spiritual consciousness to take it up. This is the real work of nature, of religion, to bring a discipline that prepares mind, life and body, lifting it towards the spiritual. And then he goes in detail on this. It has to lead him up to that point where the inner spiritual light begins fully to emerge. It is at this point that religion must learn to subordinate itself, not to insist on its outer characters, but give full scope to the inner spirit itself to develop its own truth and reality. This thing I'm rereading, we had already dwelt on it last time, I'm rereading because now we have to understand on a still deeper level and also put in context of our own lives. And I will even connect it to our own culture in the practice and teaching of the integral yoga. What he has pointed out is this first base of religious working, which is a discipline that lifts towards the spiritual. And there is a point where the inner spiritual light begins fully to emerge. At that point, the very forms which were helping have to give way and allow the inner push to lead. You will see this transition is the stage at which a large part of humanity which turns to spirit is at. It's also the stage at which a lot of people who were when they came to Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. They had been through that initial phase of training, were now already open to and receptive to a more direct spiritual experience, and were ready to now burst out into its full possibilities. And yet, there is the hangover from that initial phase. The very things that brought me here are now as if holding me back. There was one family of people from Hyderabad. It was from the Nizam of Hyderabad and his family. And Sri Aurobindo had named them Dara and the other was Chinmay, was it? Okay. And in fact, we were told that the one whom Sri Aurobindo had named Dara was a reincarnation of the famous king. And the other person was a reincarnation of Aurangzeb. And they had to work out a certain karmic relation. Sri Aurobindo had asked the person who was reincarnation of Aurangzeb to serve Dara. It was part of the work of their correction of their relationship. But what was interesting was that because they came from that background of formal base of Islam from their childhood, here they often struggled with the more free and more fluid framework of the practice. And often there were letters from them going to Sri Aurobindo about something which was not good enough or not disciplined enough, not limiting enough. And Sri Aurobindo's response to them would be quite firm, saying that you have to let go of that and move on to something. And if you want to go back to that old practice, you have no place here. He had to say it quite firmly. You see the same tendency when people approach the Samadhi. There's a tendency for people to use certain forms of practice. You have to light an incense, and then what you do is swing the incense round and repeat a few mantras, look up, look down, whatever they have been used to doing in their own practice. And Mother once pointed from her window, she looked at that whole thing and pointed to that and said, there's a religion trying to develop there, but I will not let it happen. And it did happen later that somebody had written a series of articles where he had put together formulae that Mother is all-powerful, she has given formulas around flowers, and if you want to have money, then you take flower which is called wealth and offer it at the Samadhi, and if you offer 12 flowers, you'll get more wealth. If you offer on a particular day, you'll get certain results. He had made a whole formula book. And it was interesting. For quite a while, it lasted 2 or 3 years at least. There were people coming in hordes trying to implement those formulae. And of course, a large part of it had to do with getting money or overcoming problems or passing in their exams or whatever it was. And it became almost unmanageable at some point. And it was fortuitous. It was also the skill of the people who were handling the situation then, that there were some repairs to be done at the ashram, near the ashram gate. And for a few days, people had to come from a different gate. And they used that occasion to put a notice that said, no flowers, please. And that whole thing fizzles out. But what happened in the process was, the no flowers, please became a strict rule. No more flowers. Now it is almost like a religious order that says, no flowers. You go to the Mother's room or Sri Aurobindo's room, there's a big board that says, no pranams. It's quite a violent, loud, capital letter statement. No pranams. And when they first began to implement that, people going in would stop and bow, and there would be somebody who would whisper loudly, no pranams. It was almost a violence when you go there with that state of openness and receptivity, which is so tender and fragile. But you can see how, fast forward another 10 years or 20 years, and no pranams, no flowers could become like an edict, which should be associated with Sri Aurobindo ashram or integral yoga or whatever form they may want to do it. Or equally, I see the other extreme. I was recently at some formal function in one of the centers where people were devoted. A large part of the people who had been invited were local friends of the devotees. Gathering numbers, they came out of respect for Sri Aurobindo. The center had Sri Aurobindo's relics. And the program began with somebody playing Sunilda's music. And the announcement before playing the music was, this is the music with which Mother used to meditate, and it's a routine in the ashram that everybody meditates with this music, so we will meditate with this. And plop, music switched on. After some number of seconds, 1 minute or something, plop, switched off, bang in the middle of the music. There was no sensitivity, either of the choice of the music or of what was said, which was completely wrong. And it was like a machine, a routine. And I said to myself, ouch. But this is how tendencies of religious forms emerge. It is unavoidable, and Sri Aurobindo will explain to us shortly why. But I'm pointing these out here because we have to be conscious of how deeply embedded this turn, of this religious turn, is within us, because it is one of nature's methods to open us to the inner reality. We have to recognize where we are, whether the form which we have, which is helping us, and perhaps there's still a form that is helping you. You wake up every morning at a fixed time, you go through a routine, you have a shower, you do your prayer, you do your puja, you do your meditation, read something, and then begin your day. Whatever the form of practice it may be, that's the discipline which tends to acquire now a religious form, which you then want to share with others. Do this, it will help you, it has helped me. And then it becomes almost like a format, because you are now teaching at a Sri Aurobindo center where new people are coming. Yes, this is how we have to do it, and whoop, it becomes a fixed structure. The problem though is, if it becomes rigid, if it suffocates a more spontaneous inner awakening, then it hardens. In the very nature of Sri Aurobindo's teachings, if you have bothered to read, if you have bothered to feel anything of the mothers of Sri Aurobindo's writings or her talks, you will very quickly outgrow this. But if you have not, one can see how the tendency comes. And as you can see also, the tendency goes into extremes. First there was this extreme of excess of flowers, and then the extreme of no flowers. Earlier you could go when the crowds were less. You could go to Sri Aurobindo's room on the darshan day, and many of us would bow down and even on the ground. And we had all the time. You could take your time, and suddenly now, no pranam, keep walking, don't stop walking. And you feel guilty if you hold back the queue because someone is staring at you. But all of these are extremes through which we tend to pass. And you have to always ask, not stick to the form, ask for what. The key, he says here, is always recognize what is the intention behind. What is the intention behind the pranam? What is the intention behind the flowers? What is the intention behind no flowers? And if you're aware of the intention, then you don't get deceived by the appearance. When the notice board says no pranams, come only once, it was because a lot of people kept on going 2 or 3 times because they thought it will give them more blessings, more benefits, more money, or whatever it was they were seeking. And well, one had to put a stop to that. But what is the intention behind? And the intention is not to not do pranam. The intention is to ensure that you have a large number of people. We don't want people delayed. That's all there is to it. What's the intention when you give the flower? And if you are not clear about the intention, maybe the flower is not needed. And if you're clear about the intention, then maybe the flower can be replaced by the thing which it represents. So when you offer a flower, it is as if a symbol of your own aspiration or your own psychological values or parts of your being or your nature, which you place before the divine. But then you can place yourself. You are the flower being only a symbol of your own aspiration or your consciousness. The breaking of the coconut we can see as a symbol of the ego that has to be broken so that the sweet nectar within can release. And I don't need to break a coconut. We see in the United States, many of the Indian communities have created their own temples, and they want to replicate all the rituals. And sometimes they do it so beautifully, it's a wonder to see. But you don't have coconuts always. You can import them from somewhere, or you find a replacement. Or sometimes today you make these fake coconuts or go through, but you've lost the point if you're doing that. But in many places what I see is the unnecessary forms drop off because they are difficult to replicate and they're easy to drop off therefore. There are laws which don't allow you to light a flame. And so you have to do something else. You have electric lights which you switch on, which replace the flame. But after all that, you start questioning, why am I doing this? And if you go deep enough, you make the direct spiritual movement. So this transition, breaking out of religious form into the more direct spiritual experience, is somewhere half there. And we have to observe why we need certain forms, how much do they help. And every time you ask yourself why you do it, you'll find your way. Use it, but not be bound by it. And religion must learn to subordinate itself, not insist on its outer character. Now, what is its inner spirit? In the meanwhile, we are now in transition. In the meanwhile, it has to take up as much of man's mentality, vitality, physicality as it can, and give all his activities a turn towards the spiritual direction. The revelation of a spiritual meaning in them, the imprint of a spiritual refinement, the beginning of a spiritual character. And this is the work which we all have to do, irrespective of what forms we use. That in every activity of life, we have to bring in the sense of the sacred and put it in relation with our deepest or highest aspiration available at that moment in relation to the divine. And with it, bit by bit, there is the spiritual refinement and the beginning of a spiritual character. Our entire character begins to become spiritualized. What exactly is this character thing? There's a very interesting formulation of Swami Vivekananda which goes like this. Watch your thoughts, because your thoughts become your speech. Watch your speech, because your speech becomes your actions. Watch your actions, because your actions become your character. When you repeat an activity long enough until it becomes habitual, that's your character. But what formed it? The action you took. What made the action was a certain turn of your mind and values of priority. And it started with your thought, the way you relate to the world, to the divine. From there follows the whole chain which becomes the religious form eventually. And in your character, the religious turn or the spiritual turn of the character. If you keep this as a reference, you will find in everything you do, you say, the little corrections that you can make. Mother makes this very poignant observation. She says, if you expect to become a vehicle for the supramental truth consciousness, to speak a lie is unacceptable. Even to think a lie is unacceptable. And can we actually begin to do that? And that really takes it to a level of a challenge. We can start with the more outer forms and then move to the inner parts. But at least, even in joke, you do not speak a lie, because it creates a warping in your consciousness. But if you begin at least, and you begin to take small steps in that direction, there is the help which also comes. Now, this last part is this culturing, turning, making of a spiritual character, which is the whole purpose of religion. And it is here that also its weakness comes. Sri Aurobindo now explains, and we continue the text. It is in this attempt that the errors of religion come in. For they are caused by the very nature of the matter with which it is dealing. That inferior stuff invades the very forms that are meant to serve as intermediaries between the spiritual and the mental, vital, or physical consciousness. And often it diminishes, degrades, and corrupts them. So, on the one hand, this inferior substance which you're trying to lift up is what pulls down the very form that you give to it. But equally, on the other hand, he says, but it is in this attempt that lies religion's greatest utility as an intercessor between spirit and nature. The very fact that you make this effort is the greatest value of religion, because it's going to prepare to bridge this domain of spirit and your nature with whatever crudities it has started with. And it all of us start with animal nature. That's our starting point. Never waste time or energy in feeling guilty, in feeling angry, in feeling frustrated with your limitations. Because That's our starting point, and all of us have the same starting point. Variations only in what particular problems are there in you or in me or in another. But your problems which are sticky are as sticky as my problems which are sticky, as someone else's problems which are sticky. The stickiness inherent to human nature has only various variations of problem in each one. So we don't bother about that question at all. What matters, and the only thing which matters, is what steps do you take in the turn towards the spiritual direction, the imprint of a spiritual refinement and the beginning of a spiritual character. In the mind, in the vital, in the physical. And the moment you begin to take steps, those steps will have forms. And the forms may be very subtle or they may be very obvious. So someone may say, every morning I have to go to the temple. I have to do my pujas. I have to repeat a mantra so many times. Every Saturday or Sunday, I have to go and share my wealth with the poor people and give something in alms. And you may stick to it as a ritual, but the result of it is you learn to become more generous, less selfless. You learn to start your day with a remembrance of the divine. And then, of course, you lose yourself in your normal instincts, desires, impulses, and priorities. But that is going to influence and shape your character eventually. But in the very act of doing this, the nature which is being taken up warps the form slightly. And the form takes on this form: I am giving so much to people. I am so great. I am so generous. And it's fine. It's acceptable because at least you are not locked in the pettiness of your self-importance. Something opens out. Even if your ego is now getting its satisfaction, it opens out to something beyond its narrowness. The ego is not overcome by killing it. It is overcome by its opening to its own higher truth, which is the divine, of which it is a warped reflection. You don't erase it, you open it out through such activities, through such practices. You will remember, we mentioned last time Mother's advice to do something selfless every day, which serves nothing to your own benefit. And it's a way by which you teach yourself and shape your character and spiritualize it, prepare it. But in the very act, there'll be a distortion, and not to worry about that. Which is what I want to refer to in the earlier examples. In the act of placing flowers at the samadhi, there is the distortion, there is the exaggeration. And we have to learn to navigate around it. You will see the people with the incense going round and round, and their mind is somewhere else. I remember still, it is an example which I always found fascinating. There's somebody I would watch who would go inside the ashram building, go into the meditation hall. There are all kinds of little center points. There's a little bust of Sri Aurobindo. There's a photograph of the mother, a photo of Sri Aurobindo. And then there was on the side a little table with a notice that said, "This is a place for meditation and not for talk." Now, this was put by Champaklalji because they found some people sitting in the meditation chatting, and he took Mother's permission, put this little notice. And I would see a few people, and it was not just one, a few people who would go one by one, touch each object, and they would come to this table, touch this, and do a pranam and move on to the next. It was so mechanical. They were not even conscious of what it was there for. But what over time would be seen, and so I think it was a relative, the same person brings a child, and the child is following its mother, repeating the same thing. I said, here's something interesting. What may appear to be merely mechanical will have a shaping effect on the personality in some way or other. Perhaps with the adult it had its effect, with the child certainly it would have a more obvious effect. So the particular form of it is not important. What the form is leading you to is important, and when it leads you sufficiently close to a more direct experience, well, the form will fall away, will fade out. And this Sri Aurobindo points as the most important, the greatest utility in this attempt, and he doesn't say it is successful. The very nature of this religious form is an attempt. It cannot take you all the way to the spiritual because it is primarily focused on the form and the shaping of the nature. And yet it becomes a first step through which the other three streams of nature's working will then join and complete the movement. So now Sri Aurobindo explains, truth and error live always together in the human evolution, and the truth is not to be rejected because of its accompanying errors, though these have to be eliminated. Often a difficult business. So first we recognize you cannot express a truth without, in the very act of expressing the truth, making an error. Think about it. The moment you make a statement, this is true, you've already infused it with an error. Because either you have insisted this alone is true and the other therefore false, or in stating that this is true, you have declared it as an absolute truth, which it is not. It has its own conditionalities and limitations of context. And you have perhaps cut it out from other such truths, no more seeing and putting them in conflict, no more seeing their continuity. In the very act of stating this is false, you've made a huge error, because there is a certain circumstance where this is true also. It's an interesting exercise which one can do to help make the mind more plastic. Make any statement, however outrageous, however wrong seeming, formulate your statement and then find a circumstance in time, in space, in circumstances of human society or other, where this statement will be true. And you will always find not one but often many. And then you realize that in fact this so-called wrong statement is only wrong in the current context, but it's true in another context. Or take a statement that you consider to be an absolute truth, and now find a circumstance where it is wrong, or it fails, it becomes a partial truth, or even a complete falsehood. And as an exercise you realize, oh, I always forget the context. And if you practice this a few times, play it out with various formulations and statements, which are often your most cherished statements, you will find that your narrowness begins to give way. Do it to those statements which you have always considered to be wrong or inferior, teachings which you considered, that's not so good, that's very crude, I have something greater. Well, put that in its true context and suddenly you realize, oh, there's something so deep in it. I remember, for me, it was a great revelation. In the Islamic tradition, there is this formulation which goes, La ilaha illallah. And it's translated in English as, there is no God except Allah. Illah is plural. There are no gods except Allah, which is the one God. Or in a more crude form, what we call today fundamentalist, it will say, there is no God except Allah. All other gods are false, fake, to be destroyed, iconoclast. And then it was in an interfaith discussion taking place in a Buddhist space where we had yogi tradition and the Sufi tradition sharing. And there was a Sufi teacher living in England, speaking with an impeccable British accent, who shared, and he translated this in something. He said, there is no truth except the absolute. There's no relative truth greater than the absolute, something like that. And the idea was, Illah, as the plural of gods, is how you would translate, is the relativities, the domain of relativities. And Allah was the absolute as a reference, against which all the relativities fail. And at that point, when he said this, it hit me as almost an Upanishadic formulation, that all the relativities move towards the absolute, but always fall short. All the gods are running in the Isha Upanishad that is said. The gods keep running and Brahman is always ahead of them without ever moving. And it was the same idea formulated. And because the language is one of those very ancient languages, like Sanskrit, like the Hebrew language, where it is based on roots, when you give to it a mental form, Ilah and Allah, you give to it a mental form, you can reduce it to a very small vessel of a mental idea, gods versus the God, or you look at it in its more essential root-based sense, which is the relativities versus the absolute, and the whole thing has a very different meaning. And it struck me then, I looked at some other verses which people had translated, which they saw to be very crude, and I saw the same translation, the same text translated differently by someone else, and I could see the link which was on this deeper root level of idea. And suddenly the whole problem of the interpretation of these sacred texts had a different, it opened for me a different gate. In Sanskrit, it is much easier because Sanskrit has still retained the full sense of the roots. But in many of these other languages, which were root-based, they were based on root sounds, but have lost the roots of their languages and now have reduced themselves to certain formulations. And especially where the interpretation was locked by a clergy. It has been reduced by a declining phase of human development or an early phase of human development, which necessarily being less developed had locked the meaning into lesser forms. An attempt for a higher truth to reach down and lift humanity up is turned by humanity and reduced to lesser forms and then locked in. And it needs often a reinterpretation, a new awakening, a revivification, a deeper truth refilling to lift, to appreciate more deeply. And you see this within Islam in the Sufi tradition, which really makes that effort to go to the heart of the teaching and the spiritual core of the teaching. And the same in the Christianity, in the mystic teachings of Christianity, and the mystics who have made that attempt. The Gnosticism being one more attempt to bring a different, deeper perspective of some of these ancient teachings. And the same thing happening in India, where the questioning, first the rejection of the forms and then the questioning to go deeper, is generating this kind of a introspection and a deeper quest. Recognizing though that for each human being, what is deeper may be different. Each one goes as deep as they're able to and plateaus out there until they're ready for another depth and another depth, which leads eventually to the highest. Meanwhile, they may throw away forms, replace them by other forms, go through different teachings or interpretations of teachings, play with teachers, and each of these helps. If you look at the marketplace of teachers, and spiritual teachers in particular have a marketplace. I was present in an annual meeting which takes place in France every year. It's one of the biggest gatherings. Up to 2,000 people come. And the group is called Terre du Ciel, which is translated as Sky Earth or Sky of the Earth, something like that. And it's a spiritual gathering. And the organizers, they had some very interesting, deep presentations, but the organizers were sharing how every year there is a kind of a churning of the participants. They said about 60% of the participants are repeat, and 40% participants move on and someone else replaces them. Because they said everyone is looking for something, and they keep coming until they find what they're looking for, and then they break away. Now they don't need this market anymore. But meanwhile, it's like a marketplace. You allow anybody who has anything to teach or to offer, who comes there, shares their wares, makes presentations, and people see what fits, what works, what inspires, and moves. And they move on. And then sometimes, having gone as far as they could with one thing, they move on to the next. And in that meeting, there was somebody who came from the audience. She was very touched by something I had said, which was quoting from Sri Aurobindo. And then she comes and says to me, I am looking for what is going to be my creed. I need some belief system. I need something to follow, something to cling to. And I said, but why do you want that? Why do you want to limit yourself? Why can't you simply open up to something which is more larger, to the spiritual? And I had to struggle to understand why she needed this very narrow form of a creed of beliefs. But that was the level of entry for her at that point, and perhaps in a few years it would change. And so I've always looked at in fascination to many of these newfangled New Age movements. And it's interesting to see what they represent. If you look at it this way, here's a mass of humanity of many different levels, interests, and types. And all of them in their own pace, in their own direction, in their own way, moving towards, let's say, a higher spiritual unifying experience. Each one looks for something which will help them move from where they are one small step. And wherever there is a mass, a large mass which is waiting to make a step, a movement comes to fill that gap. Look at it this way. Somebody who enters the marketplace to become a famous teacher is trying to feel, what do people need? What attracts more people? And he fills in that need with his teaching. And he serves a very useful purpose. Because at that point he's trying to catch the largest mass to lift it to one step. May not be further, maybe even a mixed step, maybe even something heavily mixed, but still a step. And now here comes somebody else who's a teacher who says, that fellow was so successful, let me see what I can do. And he looks now for his own niche, not filling the same thing the other fellow does, but taking his forms and finding his own niche that fills in the next step, or another step, or an aspect, or a human type, more bhakti, more dhyana, more karma, whichever aspect it is. And it's interesting to see each time these new movements pop up, what exactly are they meeting? What need? What aspect of the teaching are they catching? And it's very easy to recognize this when you have this comprehensive vision that Sri Aurobindo gives to you of the integral yoga. Because in the integral yoga, all human types, all human needs, and all levels of consciousness of every part of our being are taken up to be divinized. So such a comprehensive vision necessarily has also as its practice and as its formulation a knowledge that covers all these things. And when you have that big picture, you can recognize easily where this thing fits, where that fits. And you can see how after a while, when they begin to lose their following, they reinvent themselves to shift one more level to match the current need. And you can see where it goes and also where it will fizzle out. It's interesting to observe it like that. So we recognize that there will be these degradations because it is an intermediary. So that inferior stuff invades the very forms that are meant to serve as intermediaries between the spiritual and the mental, vital or physical consciousness. It has to tap into all three. Are we tapping into all three? And this is something we need to review in our own life. Are we working to turn our mind, to turn our vital, to turn our physical consciousness equally towards the divine? And very likely, if we look deeply enough, we might find what one of these is lacking, and we need to correct for it. But recognizing all three, and then often it diminishes, degrades, and corrupts them. Three terms he uses. First thing is, when a high truth comes, you find the tendency to reduce it to something understandable. In the Dhyana Shloka, the meditation verse of the Isha Upanishad, is this very fascinating and profound formulation, which broadly goes something like this: Purna Madha. So that is complete, this is complete, and even as this emerges out of that, that remains complete. Purna, you can translate as complete, infinite, all. Now, if you use the word infinite, which is complete and infinite, are slightly different ideas, but similar, they're close enough. So that is infinite, this is infinite. The divine is infinite, the universe is infinite. Even as the universe emerges out of the divine infinity, the divine remains always infinite. Now you see, the idea has come down to a more mentalized level. Complete was perhaps more broad, more inclusive in its spiritual content, but not so accessible to what it means. Infinite, yes, it's spatial infinity or temporal infinity. And you can see how the world born out of something infinite, and that still remains infinite. Take it one more step, and you find people actually do it this way. Here is first evidence that the Vedic tradition actually had mathematics of infinity. You see, you take infinity out of the infinite, and the infinite remains. And a very simple test for this, you take all the numbers 1 to infinity and take out from them all the alternating numbers. Let's say all the even numbers. So you were counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 all the way to infinity. Now take out 2, 4, 6, 8 and separate them out. What remains up there? You still have 1, 3, 5, 7 all the way to infinity. The actual infinite remains infinite. And here you have just given birth to a whole new infinity, 2, 4, 6, 8, which goes all the way to infinity. And you can keep pulling out the infinite from the infinite an infinite number of times, and it still remains the same infinity. This is mathematics of infinity. And that's what the Isha Upanishad meditation, Dhyana Shloka is teaching you. Mathematics. You can see a reduction even now further. But to somebody who is purely mathematician with no spiritual opening or entering the domain of mathematics, it's like an awakening, and the mind suddenly touches the feeling of the infinite. Wow, this is something so wonderful. You can keep drawing out from it and it never ends. That experience is almost spiritual as touched by the mind. Extremely valuable. Sri Aurobindo refers to, I think it was at the age of 12, when he read something of the Isha Upanishad or some other Upanishadic text. And he said he had the experience of the Brahman in the mind, or the silence of the Brahman in the mind. And a mental experience is preparatory for a still deeper experience and not to be trivialized. And so a mental glimpse of the infinite and the nature of the infinite is also a preparation for your whole being now to open to it. And something in you now begins to explore in fascination. What is this wonderful thing called infinite? So you can see the diminution, degradation in the diminution, where now it has actually lost its original spiritual character. It is degraded. So in the first step, we diminished it. Now we have degraded it. And yet it's a point of contact for the truth. And then even a corruption can take place, where you exaggerate to a point where as if the truth has got warped into its opposite. But this will happen because of the nature of the substance which you are attempting to lift. But it is in this attempt that lies religion's greatest utility as an intercessor between spirit and nature. Truth and error live always together in the human evolution. And the truth is not to be rejected because of its accompanying errors, though these have to be eliminated. So now we come to this recognition that whatever you may say will have an element of error in it. And equally, it will have an element of truth in it. And so the problem is separating these two. Truth is not to be rejected because of its accompanying errors, though these have to be eliminated. Now comes the challenge. How are we going to do that? The fact that the religion states, this alone is true. My founder is alone the final teacher, the final avatar, the prophet, the only prophet. It's interesting. It's built into Islam. Because it's an Abrahamic tradition, it doesn't reject its origin. It recognizes all the earlier teachers as prophets. But then it declares Muhammad alone is the final prophet and there is no other. So built into the teaching itself is an exclusivity that locks it and says there can be nobody else. But then what happens, because as we saw, the language changes, the teaching has a context, and now you have the intercessors of the clergy which replace based on the book. And yet it's serving a purpose. But at some point it has to go through a major reformulation or reinterpretation of some kind if it has to have meaning. Otherwise, it tends to break apart. And you will see the same thing happened in Christianity. And it managed to reform itself, broke away from its darker parts to become more relevant. And the same thing is happening today. With the church in crisis in the last couple of decades, you'll find the present Pope particularly is extremely open in his formulation, even accepting things which earlier would not be acceptable. There's even a group of clergy, senior clergy, which is upset with the Pope that he's breaking away from the true teaching, and there's an internal revolt and division. But all of that is inevitable. Still, in a major statement which the Pope formally made, he accepts there are many paths to God. It's a huge step for the Church. And still it ended by saying, but Catholic Christianity is the superior one. Okay, one more step. It was in one of the meetings we had at the United Nations Climate Summit. So there were a whole group of us representing various traditions, each speaking from our own tradition's perspective of the nature of the crisis as a spiritual crisis. That was the common theme. And in the audience, there was one person who was making notes. And I realized she was actually a journalist. And then she asked a question, what do you think about the present Pope? Has he done enough? Is he doing enough? And I understood in the very question was, she was trying to provoke a statement from the group to praise the Pope, which then she would quote in her journal as such and such a group of so many spiritual and religious teachers praised the Pope for his forward-looking character. I didn't want to be trapped in it. The question was directed to me and I said, yes, of course, it's good that the Pope is coming to these statements. He has to keep up with the changing circumstances. Otherwise, his teaching will become irrelevant. It was a bit radical, perhaps. Maybe she didn't like it. But this is the perspective of the nature of the change. The Pope is changing not because he's progressive, but because he's losing a following. And if he does not change, he ceases to be relevant, or the church ceases to be relevant. So what is interesting to see, humanity moves. And if the teaching does not move with it, it ossifies, breaks down, and is often lost. But if there's a grain of truth in it, that loss can be too great a loss. And so there is often a need to revivify, to bring forward the truth and recast it in new forms. And that's where the need to translate, to state it in a more colloquial language. And in the very act of stating in a colloquial language, you degrade or you lose. And you cannot help it. The same thing happens with the music. The highest, purest music is inaccessible to people. You need to kind of reduce it to a level which is accessible. Remember, here we have, for example, the Mother's music, almost inaccessible to most people. And Sunilda's music also in a large part is on the border. And so I remember a young person going up to Sunilda's office at that time and saying, can you give me some of Sunilda's music, the more rhythmic pieces? Because as a teenager, he needed that something which was a little more exciting to connect to. But it was his attempt to reach out to a music which would uplift, which he does not get in the current environment of popular music. And if you recognize what the need is, then you will help and assist now. Try this out, and then try that, and then try that, and they become steps. So you reject, you eliminate the error. How do you do that? And here comes the most important observation of Sri Aurobindo. Often a difficult business, and if crudely done, resulting in surgical harm inflicted on the body of religion. The moment you're trying to remove the error, it's difficult to separate, first of all, because they're so intimately bound, truth and error. But the moment you try to do that in a crude way, it's like a surgery which cuts out a part. And this is very interesting, the way he formulates it. He says, surgical harm inflicted on the body of religion. Meaning religion has a body. And this wording is very important to understand deeply. Here is one of those very deep truths. Easy to gloss over, but when you read a second time and a third time, as you grow in consciousness, suddenly that word acquires, or that phrase acquires such an extraordinary meaning. In the Vedic tradition, knowledge is described as a being. The divine as knowledge personified is being of knowledge, and the limbs of knowledge are described, and the Vedas are as if the four parts of this being. And then there are the secondary Vedangas, the limbs of Veda, and then the Upavedas, the derived Vedic, Veda being knowledge, the derived knowledge, all of which make for the overall body. The eyes of this being of knowledge are astrology, Jyotisha. What does it mean? When knowledge sees, it sees through appearances but sees the future. The arms of action are such and such, and even the Ayurveda is one of the limbs of this action. I unfortunately don't have the full picture of the body, but the idea being that it's as if the totality of knowledge has its special forms. And then this idea is taken up, the same image is used to describe human society. Human society is like a body. There are those who represent the aspect of knowledge. There are those who represent, like the shoulders and arms, the aspect of power and dynamism. And then there are those who represent the stomach, who digest, who produce, who process, create nourishment for society. And then there are those who represent the legs by which society walks, moves. And these are the four layers or four aspects of society. Any of these missing would make society ineffective. This same picture, Sri Aurobindo puts in a different vocabulary. He describes as the chariot of Jagannath. And he describes society as a chariot moving forward, and what are the requirements for it to be able to move forward, for it to be complete, to be able to carry the whole of society as one mass. But it's interesting that he makes this analogy, because in this very same text of the Purusha Sukta, which describes this society in its four parts, we have the exact replication of this in the form of the temple, which is replicated in the form of the chariot, which is the walking temple, which is the walking being that is society, which is God Himself as society. Now you see this big picture. God is moving. Universe is evolving. And that represents in a society as society, or God expressing in the society as moving, which is symbolized in the form of the individual, each one of us, in the form of the temple, which is the intermediary, which is the chariot, which is the form of the temple that can move around. Very interesting. In the old days, you will find many of the temples were formed with the same vocabulary as the chariot, and often having the wheels of the chariot. If you see one of the most famous ones in Orissa, the Sun Temple of Konark, has wheels representing, each wheel is one of the months of the year, and then something which represents the seven, and the whole thing is the cycle of time and the movement forward. And centered within is the deity who is moving, the sun, the truth, which of course includes everyone carrying everything together with him. So when he speaks of this body of religion, with this background, now you can appreciate religion itself is as if a formulation, an embodiment of the divine in society, meant to assist this forward movement. And in any formulation of religion, there is like a child growing up, a maturing of its forms, and then sometimes an aging of its forms. And the aging parts have to be dropped off to be regenerated from within. And that's how you see religion as a body, as a force in society, in humanity, in human evolution, as carrying forward something. If you think about it in this way, now look at what this means. If crudely done, results in surgical harm inflicted on the body of religion, an arm is cut off, or an eye is lost, or a leg is cut, or an organ of digestion is removed, what happens to the religion? It becomes ineffective, loses its force. Now if you look at, I began with that one example of Catholic Christianity splitting into Protestantism. And you see what happens there. And Mother makes this observation. In the original form in which Catholic Christianity formed, there are, of course, we know historically it was not just the teaching of Christ. There was the existing Druidic tradition. There was the existing cults and religions of Rome, which then co-opted the teaching of Christ and put Christ in the center to justify itself and to bring a spiritual element into what had otherwise become quite lost in its symbols and in its forms. So the entry of Jesus brings as if a spiritual force of light to reform an existing stale form of body. That's why in his teaching he speaks of, my God is a God of mercy and love, your God is of hate and anger. He makes this division, my God versus your God, and he's trying to bring this aspect of love into the collectivity. And then the Rome as a civilization and as an empire and a whole machinery of empire co-opts this light, in the process, of course, darkening and clouding it a little, into its existing forms. And so you have all the details of the papacy and the hierarchy and the dress code they wear and the rituals they do, which belong to an earlier phase of Druidic teachings, perfectly replicated, going back many thousand years perhaps. But with it involving an occult knowledge and an occult power, now tied with the spiritual content. And to this day, the Mother observes, so we now come to what Mother says, she observes that the Catholic teaching and the Church has an occult power of action. And when Protestantism broke away from the Church, it lost that occult component in the rejection of the ritualism, but went to a deeper spiritual and experiential component. It lost the religious power of occult. And on the other side, the Church lost the spiritual component. So here are two forms, both claiming to follow the same teaching, the same book, but one which has a great occult power but has mostly lost its spiritual content, the other which is holding to a spiritual content but has lost its occult power. And the Mother makes this observation, it would be very effective if the two could come together in some way, because the spiritual could use the power of the occult and the vehicle of the religion. And now look at the text we're reading, where Aurobindo speaks of these four streams: religion, occultism, and then the third being the spiritual philosophy, and then the spiritual experience. It's as if the coming together of these two halves would have made for a more complete mix of at least three of these streams. But you see how in the very act of that separation, something is cut out, something is lost, which loses an important element. The surgical harm can have many other effects on, for example, cutting out the bhakti element and leaving only knowledge, or cutting out the knowledge element and leaving only bhakti, or removing the karma element. You see this in India, in the Vedic tradition, where certain specializations developed. And there is this whole aspect of the Vedic practice, which is purely the ritual, doing the pujas and the havan and the ritual associated with it, which is extremely powerful. It has an occult component. It can invoke rain. It can invoke any of the deities, the various aspects of the divine, and you can have extraordinary experiences of the presence invoked and then released. And the other side is the Jnana Kanda, the aspect of knowledge, which is purely philosophy, without this. And the two have almost as if split apart, and they do not meet. And if anybody meets, they just recognize the symbolism, but get sucked very quickly into the form, because form of practice has a greater tangibility. And then those again splitting, including, as I have mentioned earlier, one of the very famous schools in India, which has completely lost all spiritual practice. Even meditation is discouraged. All you need is to understand the philosophy, and that's your way to liberation. You don't have to do anything else. So the teachers there will say, I understand that I am part of oneself. Myself is a form of the oneself. And so now I'm free. I'm liberated because I've understood it. And again, it is true in one part of the mind. You can say that part of the mind is as if half liberated. To that extent, it is true. But what about the rest of you? Well, to the extent that you live in the intellect and all your behavior is driven by the intellect, you can even say, my intellect, at least in its belief, is more free. But it's not really changed the rest of you. This is just to show how these kinds of divisions can easily happen in this attempt to remove an error that you lose something deep. No flowers, no pranams. If you exaggerated it, you would lose a deep truth. So, surgical harm inflicted on the body of religion. You could ask yourself, if there is body of religion, what is mind of religion? And what is soul of religion? And it would lead to a very interesting insight. And we do find, as I mentioned earlier, in Islam, for example, I would describe Sufism as the soul of Islam. And similarly, in Christianity, there are groups which represent the soul of the teaching. Not always open to all, and often using a twilight language, double language, remaining reasonably secret for fear of persecution because they are too different. Sometimes they even do things which are unacceptable to the larger body. So mainstream Islam teaches you should not use flowers, you should not do any rituals, you should not sing. But in Sufism, you do use flowers and you sing because it is an expression through the heart and the bhakti, in immersion in the divine through certain ritual forms of dance or other. So often they are persecuted and called non-Islamic. And if you ask, have you heard this dialogue between a Sufi and a traditional Islamist? And the traditional fellow says, what is Sufism? It's not Islam. He says, no, I'm more Muslim than you, the Sufi says. So what's the difference, he asks. Why do you call yourself Sufi? And the Sufi smiles and keeps quiet. So in the very definition of a Sufi practitioner, you are said, the moment you declare yourself to be a Sufi, you are no more a Sufi. And the idea being that what you seek is something so essential that you cannot reduce it to form. But when the question is asked, the fellow has to answer. So he said, well, we are like the heart, we are like the core, we are like the pure form of Islam. These are all words. But the idea, think about what it means. Body of religion and soul of religion. And the same could be said even of a written teaching. The soul of the teaching versus the body of the teaching. Sri Aurobindo refers to this in his writings on the Bhagavad Gita. He says in every such religious scripture, then there are many. The world abounds with scriptures, sacred and profane, he writes. But in every one of these, there is the spiritual core, and then there is the component which belongs to the context of the age and the period and society. For what we see as error is very frequently the symbol or a disguise or a corruption or malformation of a truth which is lost in the brutal radicality of the operation. The truth is cut out along with the error. So again, a very powerful sentence, a very profound sentence which has application everywhere else. If you're sitting in a business meeting, trying to work out a business strategy, you will find this situation applies. You're sitting in any problem solving, in any social context, in any developmental strategy, whether governmental or in your personal life, you'll find this to be a truth. That the moment you say, this is wrong and we must remove this error, if you're not careful in how you separate the error, you are very likely to cut out a truth with the error and lose in the process something very important. Which you see, for example, in the modern developmental thought. When they say development, what do they mean? Crush all nature. Remove anything which represents for you the wild, undeveloped earth. So it used to be, and it still is to a great extent all over India and in large parts of the world, okay, we are going to develop this area. the government comes and says, the first thing they do, they cut out all the trees, flatten the land. And often it takes a year or two for the funds to come. So meanwhile, the land has become desert, barren. And then you build these ugly houses. And then you have ugly houses in a barren desert. People who live in that barrenness, emptiness. And after a while, if they feel too empty, they'll bring a little pot or a plant around outside their door, or try to grow some trees, hopefully. And it never strikes the developmental approach to say, why can't we build the houses around the trees, include the trees into the space which has to develop? The word development has been associated now with something so crude and so violent on nature that you see it accompanied by a poisoning of life and a destruction of life. And now, of course, you want to reverse it. Remove this development, go back to the other extreme. And you can see this pendulum swinging between two truths because you did not take the trouble to disentangle the distortion without protecting the truth. So this is just one example. We will find innumerable examples. It's also in our individual life. Every time you find yourself saying, enough of this, stop, end, cut, watch out, you're cutting out a truth. Can you pause and try to disentangle, make a correction? And he gives you now 4 words which will help to do this. What happens when the truth is cut out? He says, when the error is cut out, for what we see as error is very frequently the symbol or a disguise or a corruption or malformation of a truth which is lost in the brutal radicality of the operation. So the way the truth, the error was in fact a truth modified in these 4 ways or 4 degrees. The most subtle is a truth which is malformed. So a malformed truth, for example, might be when the mother said, for example, in Aurobindo, she said that there should be no sense of ownership of land, or there should be no sense of money or ownership of property. You can, of course, warp it and give to it some exaggerated form where no money at all. So how are you going to live? You have more money? We don't care how much money you have. But we have to somehow manage, get resources. We don't want your money. Something wrong in the way you have rejected money by declaring it as wrong or false or an error. Not recognizing money is needed. And Mother herself provides you with the corrective. She says, yes, but it will take a while to transition into that stage of no money. In between, there's an intermediate passage of money. But to go towards something, how do we work that out? If you're careful, you don't cut out the truth. This is the radical form in which the ascetics did it. Money is temptation. Cut out all temptation, cut out all money, cut out all power, then you can be spiritual and free. And of course, it does not work, as we have seen. The tendency takes a more subtle form, even in our context, of people who come to Sri Aurobindo. And it may take the form where you have a disdain for wealth or money, or you look down on it in some way. And these are all remnants of that perversion. But so malformation of a truth can sometimes be extremely subtle. When the mother says that don't bind yourself too much to the form of a practice, well, people then cut out completely all forms of practice. And you have then perversion again. Corruption takes it to an extreme form where you do not recognize anymore the truth in it. It seems almost to acquire its opposite character. Or disguise. The truth is now hidden in a completely different form. If you speak of, for example, maybe we will have more time to look at examples of this next time, but the act of giving a flower or receiving a flower, The truth behind is often concealed in the form of the flower. Mother used to give flowers. She held in her consciousness a certain energy. The flower was a vehicle with which the energy was transmitted. The experience was transmitted. People would hold the flower. This is the flower Mother gave me. Press it between books, dry it out, store the flower. Were they conscious of the content which she gave? Very likely not. Most cases not. But if you received the content, there's a point where you can say, now the container is no more relevant. Do you need to cling to that? If you still feel the container having the content, of course you will cling to it. So it's very interesting to see how objects used by the mother have something of her force. But if you cling to the object, you lose the force. If you absorb the force, then the object is almost secondary. So now here's an object used by the mother. It fell and it broke. What do you do with the broken pieces? Well, you can still store them, but does it still contain the presence? What do you do with that? Mother herself used to say regarding the blessing packets that after 1 year they tend to lose their force, and the best way at that point is to dispose of them, in the best way being to burn it if you can, instead of throwing it in the waste bin. So again you pause, why not? It still has a symbolic value. So that is the other element, the fourth, which he says, symbol. Symbol, disguise, corruption, malformation of a truth. So symbol of the truth, the blessing packet is a symbol. Even if it has lost the force, it meant for you that thing. Something of mother's consciousness, her picture, something which came with it, or an association with the experience which you had when you held it. And perhaps if it still holds that, you may retain it, or if you choose to discard it, still recognizing the symbolic character doesn't go away, so you don't throw it away, because throwing in the waste bin is a symbol of throwing away what you received, whereas burning it is a symbol of its dissolution in the origin, or its ascent in the flame to the source. The symbol of the manner in which you throw again has a value, because it's a symbol. I've seen a lot of people, for example, using the symbol of the mother or Sri Aurobindo in letters that came, or sometimes perfunctory formal letters. So this letter comes, you finished work with it, you tear it up and throw it in the waste bin, not noticing that there was a symbol over it. Are you conscious, or is it merely a design? It's not a design, it's a symbol. A symbol is a higher truth represented on a lower level in a vehicle or a form which is of different substance. Think about what that means when you throw it away like this or tear it up. And it's difficult once you become conscious of this, or you avoid using the symbol except where it has a spiritual component. But often you see people putting recklessly mother's symbol on t-shirts or on clothes. And for a while the ashram used to distribute saris which had mother's symbol on the hem. And the problem was, you wore the sari and the hem was banging against your feet or dragging on the floor, and it was mother's symbol which was being dragged around. It had become a design. Now, of course, that has also stopped, but somewhere the lack of the sensitivity of what it represents. One has to become conscious that behind any error also there can be a truth, but now symbolized in the error. In Islam, when there is this idea of fighting for God, and this is the jihad, which is so misused now with suicide bombers, the truth of it in the symbol was that you commit yourself to fight against all the falsehood in your own nature or in life and in society. And the idea behind it and the truth of it was this absolute, exclusive dedication to the divine will, where you set aside all personal will or all comfort, even willing to die for a greater truth. That complete abnegation of the personal ego. That's the truth behind. The moment you formulated it, though, in terms to a people who are not yet ready for what this truth represents, you see how it can very quickly be perverted and now turned into an army which is willing to die, because now they will go to paradise when they die fighting for the jihad. and then exaggerated to more modern forms of a suicide bomber. Complete perversion. But behind that, you can see there was a truth, a deep spiritual truth, applied in the wrong context, wrong material, is completely destroyed and becomes even a falsehood and a malformation. But the symbol is still there in the practice of the jihad, which is the fight against those tendencies within you which are contrary to the divine will. But because Islam in its very nature represents that aspect which is forceful and powerful in the relation with God, with the divine, its relationship with the change to oneself is also hard, harsh, violent, and so battle, jihad. The same thing in a softer form may be done differently, a softer form of religion. In Christianity, for example, it takes the form where you confess. I made a mistake. Instead of violently fighting against that error, I open it, offer it to God with a intention that I will not repeat that error. And somehow that error is as if absolved, dissolved, removed from you. Again, it's reduced to corrupted in form, where now you have a clergy sitting across a wall, you confess, the clergy asks you questions, sometimes probing, takes all the mistakes which you have made, which you feel guilty about, passes it on to the central control of the Pope, and now they have something by which they can blackmail you. This is how it was in Europe. That it became a vehicle for blackmail to control society because people had to confess. But if you didn't confess, then you were not opening yourself to God. But in the act of confessing, you were coming under the treachery of the institution. Corruption again. But behind it is a truth, which is often disguised. And if you removed the clergy and opened yourself, that would be one way of dealing with erroneous parts within you. Or in the more natural way of the karma yogi, I made a mistake, what do? I will take steps to now undo the harm I have caused or the error I have made in whatever form. If I have caused loss, I will do something to correct it. If I have caused hurt, I will apologize, whatever form it takes, but through action. And there you can see how it takes a more distorted form if it is reduced now to karma. I have hurt you, now I must suffer the consequences, and it is now becoming a mathematical karmic equation. You are hurting me, I must have caused some karmic harm to you, which I am now having to suffer. And so everything is reduced to suffering and measures of suffering. So any of these forms, deep truths, could be distorted easily, will be distorted because that's the nature of the material in which it is being received. But the point he makes is, when you make a radical correction, the truth is cut out along with the error. And this is what we need to introspect every time we find ourselves doing something too harshly, with others or with ourselves. Now comes the conclusion of this whole discussion. In nature's way, remember the whole goal was to understand nature's wide and supple working and the place of this whole religious operation of awakening. Nature herself very commonly permits the good corn and the tares and weeds to grow together for a long time, because only so is her own growth, her free evolution possible. The analogy he gives this is of farming or free growth in nature in a forest. And you see three things. The good corn, this is going to be nourishing, this is what we are looking for. Then there is the tare and then the weed. The tare is an intermediate. The weed is what you don't want, which seem as if to destroy the good. And in between is the tare, which is more like an ordinary grass. Incidentally, the word tare is one of those which goes to the old language and goes to the root of language and has its correspondence in Sanskrit in the etymology. Taru, Proto-German, tarva, tarvo, and Proto-Indo-European drve, Dirva in Lithuanian and Durva in Sanskrit of today. Grass. It's one of those words which actually spans a very large space across cultures. But Sri Aurobindo uses these words very selectively. You see, he has a very rich vocabulary, and in his own consciousness, as a master of Greek, Latin, French, and many other languages, even including, I believe, Russian, and even a bit of Gaelic, which he knew. As someone who knew these sounds from the root, and of course Sanskrit and Indian languages, he uses these words with their root sense. And ter is one of those. It has the sense of grass which is not harmful, and yet it's not what you were seeking. And then there is the growth which is the weed, which is harmful, can even suffocate the healthy food that you grow. And the corn here is the food which is nourishment for the growth of the soul. The weed is that which clogs and covers and blocks that growth. And the tear is that which is something in between, fills in the space. But if you look at nature's working in the growth of the forest, all three are necessary. The weed is what is the most hardy, spreads into the desert, grips itself, survives, and mulches the soil, prepares it and builds the microbiome, in which the grass can grow, and which prepares the ground eventually for the more fragile but nourishing food that has to grow. And so think of it in these three steps. Nature herself does this, and her free evolution is possible when all three levels are included. And this we understand now in the context of religion. Having understood this and the mix of truth, falsehood, and the necessity of subtle separation, the next paragraph takes up how nature awakens us to the spiritual and to the divine. The first awakening, she says, is to a rudimentary spiritual consciousness in a vague sense of the infinite and the invisible. And we will explore that in detail next Sunday.